Picture this. It's spring of 1835, and the American frontier is still this wild, untamed beast that's slowly being carved up by men with more courage than sense. Fort Bridger sits like a lonely outpost in what we'd call Wyoming today, but back then it was just nowhere. The edge of the world, really. A place where civilization came to die, or maybe where it came to be reborn into something harder, meaner, and infinitely more dangerous. Through those rough-hewn gates walks Jake Morrison, and folks, let me tell you something about this man. He's carrying a rifle that's going to make history, though nobody knows it yet. Not the grizzled mountain men spitting tobacco juice into the dirt, not the traders haggling over beaver pelts, and certainly not the 5 wealthy Boston merchants who are about to make the kind of mistake that legends are built on. Now, Morrison's rifle, and this is important, this weapon looked nothing like what you'd expect a mountain man to carry. Think about it. We're talking about an era when bigger was better, when a gun needed to drop a charging buffalo or an angry Blackfoot warrior at 100 yards. The standard issue was heavy, brutal, functional. British doubles that could stop a bear, Hawken rifles that could punch through a tree, weapons built like clubs because sometimes that's exactly what they became. But Morrison's rifle? It was art. Pure, deadly art. The barrel was octagonal, 8-sided, made of Pennsylvania steel, but finished with a precision that would make a Swiss clockmaker weep. German silver inlays depicted hunting scenes so detailed you could almost hear the hounds baying. The brass patchbox was engraved with flowing vine patterns that caught the light like liquid gold. And the stock? Oh, the stock was tiger maple, this incredible wood that seemed to glow from within, honey-coloured stripes running through it like captured sunlight. It looked, and I cannot emphasize this enough, absolutely nothing like a weapon of war. So when Morrison pushes through the doors of Hartley's trading post, and picture this place, smoke so thick you could cut it with a knife, the smell of beaver pelts and whiskey and unwashed bodies all mixing together. When he walks in carrying this work of art, well, you can imagine the reaction. The 5 Boston merchants are there doing what wealthy men do, showing off. These aren't just any rich guys, mind you. We're talking about Thomas Worthington and his crew, men who've spent more on their hunting gear than most folks see in a lifetime. Worthington's carrying a $4,000 London fowling piece. $4,000. To put that in perspective, that's like walking around with a Ferrari today, except it's 1835, and you're in the middle of nowhere. And these men, they take one look at Morrison's rifle, and they just lose it. The laughter starts slow, then builds. "What a pretty little toy gun," Worthington says, and you can hear the contempt dripping from every word. "Did you win it at a county fair? Mountain man?" Now here's where you need to understand something about Jake Morrison. This isn't some greenhorn who wandered into the wrong saloon. This man has been carved by the frontier like a statue carved from stone, 27 years old, but those years, they count double out here. Maybe triple. His father, Scottish immigrant, trying to make a new life, died under Blackfoot arrows when Jake was 7. 7 years old! Can you imagine watching your father get cut down by warriors who moved like ghosts through the wilderness? That's the kind of trauma that either breaks a man completely or forges him into something unbreakable. Morrison didn't break. Jim Bridger himself took the boy in, taught him everything. How to read the wind like a book. How to move through hostile territory without leaving so much as a bent twig. How to shoot, fight, survive in a world that wanted to kill you every single day. Grey eyes that had seen more death than any man should witness, lines carved deep by weather and worry and the constant tension of staying alive. And here's the beautiful irony. The rifle they're mocking? It exists because of mercy. 3 winters before this moment, Morrison saved a 13-year-old girl named Greta Zimmerman from a wolf pack outside Fort Laramie. Picture it. Winter in Wyoming, wolves desperate enough to hunt near human settlements, a girl who wandered too far from safety. Morrison appeared like something out of a fairy tale, dropping wolves with shots that seemed impossible, moving through the pack like death itself. Her father, Hans Zimmermann, was a master gunsmith from Bavaria, not just a guy who assembled parts, but an artist whose family had been making firearms for 5 generations. The techniques he used, the precision he brought to his work. This was old-world craftsmanship meeting new-world necessity. And when he decided to repay Morrison for saving his daughter's life, he didn't just make a gun. He created a masterpiece. 14 months of work. 14 months. The barrel wasn't just cut. It was crafted with techniques that American gunsmiths didn't even know existed. The rifling, those spiral grooves that spin a bullet for accuracy, was twisted in a pattern so precise it gave projectiles stability that shouldn't have been possible. The lock mechanism was so finely tuned it would fire in driving rain when other rifles became expensive clubs. But the Boston merchants don't know any of this. They see the pretty inlays, the artistic stock, the delicate appearance, and they assume it's decorative. A gentleman's toy. Something for shooting clay pigeons at country estates, not for serious work on the frontier. Morrison stands there, weathered hands tracing the octagonal barrel, and the silence stretches like a held breath. Then he speaks, voice soft as distant thunder. This pretty toy has dropped more game at 300 yards than your fancy British guns could hit at 50. The laughter dies. It's taken 17 men who thought otherwise, including Baptiste Leroux at Pierre's hole when he wagered his entire season's catch. I couldn't shoot the ace from a playing card at 100 paces. And folks, here's what makes this moment so perfect, so quintessentially American. Morrison's rifle represents everything the frontier was about. It wasn't the biggest or the loudest or the most expensive. It was the product of different worlds coming together. German craftsmanship, Scottish determination, American innovation, native wisdom, all forged in the crucible of survival. The merchant's expensive boots shuffle uneasily on the wooden floor. Morrison's reputation isn't just local legend, it's documented fact. The man who could shoot the eye from a flying eagle, who had survived 6 years alone in Blackfoot country, territory so dangerous most men wouldn't enter it with an army, who moved through the mountains like smoke, appearing and disappearing according to his own mysterious logic. With practiced ease that speaks of 10,000 repetitions, Morrison begins loading his rifle. The German-made bullet slides home with barely a whisper, the precision of the bore evident in that simple sound. The wealthy merchants, who moments before were laughing at this toy gun, suddenly realize they might have made a terrible mistake. But what Morrison doesn't know, what none of them know, is that this moment is just the beginning, because 500 miles north, in the shadow of Devil's Crown Peak, something is stirring. Something that has been killing men for 5 years, turning the Yellowstone region into a graveyard. Something that even the native tribes, who fear nothing in this world, whisper about in hushed tones around their fires. The monster they call Old Scarback is about to make Morrison's rifle either legendary or the last thing he ever holds. Now, before we get to what happens next with Morrison and his remarkable rifle, we need to talk about the nightmare that was waiting for him up north. Because, folks, Old Scarback wasn't just another grizzly bear. This was something else entirely. Something that had turned the Yellowstone region into what we might call today a no-go zone. Picture a creature standing 12 feet tall on his hind legs. 12 feet, that's looking up at a basketball hoop, except instead of a rim, you're staring into the maw of something that weighs nearly 1,000 pounds of muscle, bone, and pure predatory rage. But size alone doesn't make a legend. What made Old Scarback truly terrifying was his intelligence, his scars, and his absolutely methodical approach to killing human beings. The scars told the story of 5 years of warfare. A ruined left eye, courtesy of a Shoshone spear that had somehow found its mark without killing the bear. Claw marks from rival grizzlies who had challenged his dominance and lost. And the distinctive scar that gave him his name. A jagged line running from skull to shoulder, carved by some weapon or claw that had come within inches of ending his reign of terror. But it was the killing that made him legendary. 17 confirmed human kills in 5 years. Now, you might think, okay, 17 people, that's tragic, but grizzlies kill people, except these weren't random maulings. These were calculated executions carried out by something that seemed to understand human behavior better than humans understood his. The native tribes, who had lived alongside dangerous predators for countless generations, had never seen anything like old Scarback. The Blackfoot called him Matoroyis, shadow that walks, and they believed he carried the vengeful spirits of ancient warriors who had died unavenged. Think about that for a moment. These are people who hunted buffalo on foot with spears, who considered counting coup on an armed enemy the height of bravery, and they were terrified of this bear. The Crow knew him as a curse made flesh, punishment for forgotten sins against the natural world. Even the Shoshone, who were absolutely fearless in battle. These are the people who would charge cavalry units armed with nothing but war clubs. They abandoned their ancestral hunting grounds rather than face old Scarback. And the white settlers? The mountain men? The professional hunters? They were dying faster than anyone could count. Let me tell you about Lord Pemberton. This wasn't some greenhorn tourist. This was a man who had hunted man-eating tigers in India, who had faced down charging rhinos in Africa. He arrived in the territory with $10,000 worth of equipment. That's insane money for 1830. And elephant guns powerful enough to drop any animal that walked the earth. Scarback tore him apart in Box Canyon like he was made of paper. The bear didn't just kill Pemberton. He systematically destroyed him and his guide, leaving pieces scattered across a quarter-mile of forest. The elephant guns? Found days later, their massive barrels bent like pretzels, as if the bear had taken the time to ensure these weapons could never threaten anything again. Then there was Running Eagle, war chief of the Shoshone. This man was legend even before he encountered Scarback. A warrior who had never known defeat, who carried scars from 50 battles and wore each one like a badge of honor. When Scarback killed his son during a hunting expedition, Running Eagle did what any father would do. He declared war. For 2 months. 2 months. Running Eagle tracked that bear through territory so dangerous that even other Shoshone warriors wouldn't follow. The final confrontation became the stuff of campfire legend, passed down through generations of storytellers. Hand-to-hand combat between a warrior's lance and 8-inch claws, strength against speed, human determination, against animal fury. They found Running Eagle's body scattered across a quarter-mile of forest, his war lance snapped like kindling. But perhaps the most chilling case was the Mackenzie Party, 5 experienced hunters from Canada, men who knew the wilderness like their own backyards, who had survived everything the frontier could throw at them. They entered what became known as Blood Moon Canyon, tracking what they thought was just another large grizzly. They simply vanished. Search parties found their rifles, all 5 of them, barrels bent like horseshoes, stocks shattered into splinters. But no bodies, no remains, no trace of what had happened to 5 grown men, except the evidence that old Scarback had taken the time to methodically destroy their weapons before. Whatever came next, the psychological impact was devastating. Trade routes changed, entire regions were abandoned. The Hudson's Bay Company lost 3 trading posts when their employees simply refused to work in Scarback's territory. The bear had effectively created his own kingdom of terror, a realm where human beings existed only as prey. And here's what made it worse. Scarback seemed to enjoy it. Witnesses reported that the bear would sometimes toy with his victims, appearing and disappearing like a ghost, letting people know he was there before striking. He would destroy camps without killing anyone, as if sending a message. He understood that fear was as effective a weapon as claws and teeth. Morrison might have avoided this nightmare indefinitely. The smart money said, "Stay away from Yellowstone. Stick to safer territory. Let someone else deal with the monster." And Morrison was nobody's fool. He'd survived in hostile country for 20 years by knowing when to fight and when to walk away. But fate, as it tends to do, had other plans. The 1835 Summer Rendezvous was the social event of the Mountain Man calendar. Think of it as part trade fair, part family reunion, part drunken brawl, all rolled into one massive gathering where everyone who lived by trapping, hunting, and trading came together to exchange goods, stories, and gossip. Morrison was there with his blood brother, White Hawk, a Crow warrior who had saved Morrison's life during a Sioux raid 3 years earlier. In Crow culture, this wasn't just friendship. It was sacred bond, stronger than family, binding unto death. White Hawk was tracking elk near Devil's Crown Peak when it happened. 40 witnesses at the rendezvous watched in absolute horror as old Scarback erupted from the tree line like a force of nature given flesh, 30 yards covered in heartbeats, moving faster than something that size had any right to move. White Hawk was an experienced warrior, a man who had killed buffalo with bow and arrow, who had counted coup on armed enemies. His arrows found their mark perfectly. They bounced off Scarback's hide like pine needles off stone. The killing took less than a minute, but those screams, 40 people heard those screams, and they echoed for what felt like eternity. But here's the part that chilled Morrison to his very core. After the killing, Scarback didn't retreat. He waited. The bear stood over White Hawk's remains and watched as Morrison approached, one good eye fixed on the mountain man with unmistakable intelligence. Then, as if he had made his point, old Scarback melted back into the forest with the silence of smoke. That night, Morrison underwent the crow mourning ritual. He cut his hair and his flesh, mixing his blood with White Hawk's, in an ancient vow of vengeance that transcended cultures, transcended races, transcended everything except the bonds between brothers. The territorial government had placed a $5,000 bounty on old Scarback, enough money to buy a small ranch and live comfortably for years. But Morrison couldn't have cared less about the money. This was about brotherhood. This was about debt. This was about a promise made in blood under stars that had witnessed 10,000 years of such promises. Old Scarback had killed the wrong man's brother, and now, for the first time in 5 years, the monster was going to discover what it felt like to be hunted by something just as relentless, just as intelligent, and infinitely more motivated than anything he had faced before. The question was, would Morrison's pretty toy gun be enough to stop a legend? December of 1835 brought a blizzard that old-timers still talked about decades later, snow falling so thick you couldn't see your own hand stretched out in front of your face. Wind howling like every banshee in hell had been turned loose at once, visibility dropping to mere feet, turning the wilderness into a white void where death could approach from any direction without warning. Most sane people would wait out weather like this, huddled around fires, telling stories, and praying for spring. But Jake Morrison wasn't most people, and he certainly wasn't concerned with sanity. He had chosen winter deliberately, and the worse the weather got, the better it suited his purposes. You see, Morrison had spent months preparing for this hunt, and every detail was calculated. The deep snow would slow even a 1,000-pound grizzly, force Scarback to move through predictable routes, limit his escape options. The blizzard would mask Morrison's scent and sound, eliminate the bear's advantages of superior hearing and smell. Most importantly, snow would preserve tracks, creating a trail even Morrison's remarkable skills could follow. For 3 days, he followed signs that would have been invisible to anyone else. A tuft of grizzled fur caught on pine bark 8 feet off the ground. Claw marks gouged into tree trunks higher than a man could reach. That distinctive musky scent that made horses scream in terror and sent dogs whimpering for cover. Morrison read the wilderness like a book written in a language only he understood. But here's what made Morrison different from every other hunter who had tried to kill old Scarback. He didn't just track the bear. He studied him. Morrison had spent weeks collecting every account of Scarback's attacks, mapping the bear's territory, identifying patterns that others had missed in their terror. Scarback always attacked from upwind, using his superior sense of smell to locate prey before they detected him. He always went for the head first, not the throat like most predators, but the skull, crushing it like an eggshell with jaws that could bite through a tree trunk. And most importantly, when wounded or threatened, he always retreated toward Devil's Crown Peak and the ancient caves beneath it. Those caves were the key to everything. Blackfoot oral tradition spoke of Devil's Crown as the gateway to the shadow world, where the barrier between life and death grew thin. The caves themselves were older than memory, carved by water and time into a labyrinth that descended deep into the mountain's heart, perfect shelter for something that wanted to disappear, but also a trap for anything foolish enough to follow. Morrison carried 50 specially cast bullets, each one blessed by a Blackfoot medicine man and marked with symbols of power. He had learned enough from his years among various tribes to understand that sometimes the spiritual world was just as real as the physical one. And when you were hunting something like old Scarback, you needed every advantage you could get. On the third dawn of his hunt, as Morrison checked his rifle for what felt like the 1000th time, old Scarback announced himself with a roar that shook snow from the trees and seemed to make the very mountains tremble. The bear emerged from the white void like a mountain given life, one good eye blazing with unmistakable intelligence and something that looked disturbingly like amusement. This wasn't surprise or territorial anger. This was recognition. Scarback knew who Morrison was, knew why he was there, and the bear was pleased. Morrison's first shot was perfect. The German-crafted bullet punched through Scarback's massive shoulder, spinning the bear around, drawing a spray of blood that painted the snow crimson. Any normal grizzly would have retreated, wounded and wary. Old Scarback merely roared louder and charged. What followed wasn't a hunt in any conventional sense. It was warfare, pure and simple, a running battle through terrain that belonged in nightmares, where every step could be your last and death lurked behind every snow-laden tree. Morrison's rifle jammed in the killing cold, the one thing he had feared most, but also the one thing he had prepared for most thoroughly. Without hesitation, he cleared the mechanism with movements practiced 10,000 times, muscle memory functioning even as adrenaline turned his world into slow motion. A boulder the size of a wagon shattered under Scarback's strike, missing Morrison by inches. The chase led them higher, up slopes so steep that each step was a battle against gravity and ice. The wind grew stronger, more vicious, until it was screaming at 60 miles per hour, and every exposed inch of skin felt like it was being flayed by invisible knives. They reached a knife-edge ridge with 1,000-foot drops on either side, where one wrong step meant certain death. This is where it gets almost impossible to believe, but remember, 40 Crow warriors followed at a distance as Morrison had arranged, and they all swore sacred oaths about what they witnessed. Morrison slipped. One moment he was steady on the ice-slicked rocks, the next he was sliding backward toward a drop that would have scattered his bones across half of Wyoming. His rifle spun away from his desperate grasp, tumbling through the air like a leaf in a hurricane. Old Scarback, sensing victory, reared up on his hind legs above the falling man, 12 feet of muscle and fury, and absolute certainty. And that's when Morrison did something that shouldn't have been possible. Still sliding backward, still falling towards certain death, he caught his rifle by the barrel and brought it around in one fluid motion. The shot, fired while falling off a cliff in a blizzard at a moving target, entered through Scarback's ruined eye and exploded out the back of his skull. 200 yards they fell together, man and monster, locked in death's embrace. Morrison caught a rock outcrop 20 feet down, his hands torn bloody by the impact, but somehow, impossibly, still gripping his rifle. Old Scarback's massive body tumbled past him, 1,000 pounds of dead fury spinning through the white void until it vanished into the abyss below. The Crow warriors found Morrison hanging there, half frozen but alive, his hands locked around his rifle's stock so tightly they had to pry his fingers open one by one. Frostbite had claimed 2 toes and the tip of his left ear, but he was breathing, conscious, and according to the warriors, smiling. When they finally hauled Scarback's body up from where it had landed, and it took 6 horses and most of a day to accomplish this, they found something that made even hardened warriors step back in wonder. The bullet had entered through the ruined left eye and travelled in a perfectly straight line through the bear's brain, exiting cleanly through the back of the skull. The precision was inhuman, impossible, the kind of shot that belonged in legends rather than reality. But there was the evidence, massive and undeniable, lying in the snow. Old Scarback was dead. The 5-year reign of terror was over, and somewhere in the howling wind and driving snow, the spirits of 17 victims could finally rest. But the real question wasn't whether Morrison had killed the monster. The question was whether the frontier was ready for what came next, for what happened when a man with a pretty toy gun became legend himself, and when that legend started to change everything about how Americans thought about precision, preparation, and what one determined individual could accomplish against impossible odds. The answer to that question would reshape not just the wilderness, but the very idea of what it meant to be American. Christmas Eve, 1835. If you had been standing outside Hartley's trading post at Fort Bridger that night, you would have witnessed something that changed the American frontier forever. Not just because of what happened, but because of what it represented. The moment when Old World precision met New World determination and created something entirely unprecedented. Morrison's return became instant legend. Picture this. 6 men struggling to carry the massive Grizzly pelt through the gates, the hide so enormous it took all of them just to keep it off the ground. The head alone was the size of a wash basin, that ruined eye socket telling its own story of violence and intelligence that shouldn't have existed in any animal. Inside the trading post, Morrison himself lay recovering from frostbite and exhaustion, hands wrapped in bandages, his face bearing the permanent marks of his ordeal. But his grey eyes, those eyes that had seen too much death, they held something new. Not satisfaction exactly, not triumph, something deeper. Peace, maybe. The kind of peace that comes when a debt has been paid in full. Thomas Worthington and his fellow Boston merchants stood in stunned silence as Crow warriors recounted the story, each detail more impossible than the last. These weren't campfire tales or frontier exaggerations. These men were swearing sacred oaths about what they had witnessed. The falling shot, the impossible accuracy, the death of something that had seemed unkillable. Worthington, the same man who had mocked Morrison's pretty toy gun just months earlier, publicly offered $10,000 for the rifle. $10,000. That was enough money to buy a small city back east, enough to live like a king for the rest of your natural life. Morrison's response became part of frontier folklore. A man might as well sell his right arm or his soul. But here's the thing about legends. They don't stay contained. The story spread like wildfire through telegraph lines and newspaper columns, reaching eastern cities where it was retold in parlors and taverns, growing with each telling yet somehow never quite matching the incredible reality. What happened next, though? That's where the real story begins. Because Morrison didn't retreat into solitary wilderness like some hermit mountain man. Instead, he did something that nobody expected. He became a teacher. Near Fort Laramie, Morrison established what became known as the Morrison Training Ground. This wasn't just a shooting range or a hunting camp. This was something entirely new, a place where different worlds came together to create a synthesis that had never existed before. Morrison taught what became known as the Morrison Method, and it was revolutionary. German precision, borrowed from Hans Zimmermann's gunsmithing techniques. Native spiritual preparation, learned from years among the Crow and Blackfoot. American pragmatism, forged in 20 years of frontier survival. These weren't separate skills. They were integrated into a unified approach that treated hunting not just as killing, but as a form of art. Students came from everywhere, wealthy Eastern sportsmen who had heard the stories and wanted to learn from the man who had killed old Scarback, professional hunters who recognized that Morrison had discovered something fundamentally new about accuracy and stalking, even military officers who understood that the principles Morrison taught could be applied to warfare. And Morrison's rifle? It influenced an entire generation of American gunmakers. Hans Zimmermann, the Bavarian craftsman who had created the weapon, found himself, wealthy beyond his dreams as hunters from across the continent commissioned rifles built to Morrison's specifications. But here's the fascinating part. None of them quite captured the original's perfection. The rifle wasn't just about the mechanics, you see. It was about the integration of traditions, the fusion of cultures, the marriage of old-world craftsmanship with new-world necessity. American gunmakers studied every detail of Morrison's rifle, leading to improvements in barrel rifling, lock mechanisms, and precision manufacturing that would prove crucial decades later during the Civil War. The techniques developed trying to replicate Morrison's weapon directly influenced the firearms that would help win battles from Gettysburg to Antietam. Morrison's influence extended far beyond gunsmithing, though. His approach to hunting, the methodical preparation, the studying of patterns, the integration of different cultural approaches, became a template for how Americans approached complex problems. It was quintessentially American. Take the best from every available source, combine it in new ways, and create something better than the sum of its parts. When pneumonia claimed Morrison on a quiet Tuesday in 1846, he was found in his cabin still holding his rifle, a smile on his weathered face. Those who knew him best said he looked like a man who had lived exactly the life he was meant to live, who had no regrets and no unfinished business. The rifle's journey to what would eventually become the Smithsonian Institution included stops at numerous frontier towns where thousands came to see the weapon that had slain the terror of the Rockies. Each stop added to the legend, but also served an educational purpose. People could see firsthand the craftsmanship, understand the precision, appreciate the artistry that had made the impossible shot possible. Today, Morrison's rifle rests behind climate-controlled glass at the Buffalo Bill Center in Cody, Wyoming. The tiger maple stock still glows with that inner light. The brass inlays still depict those hunting scenes with perfect detail. The German silverwork still catches light like captured moonbeams. Museum visitors often comment on how delicate it looks, how artistic, how much like a work of art rather than a weapon of war. They're not wrong. It is art. But it's also something more. It's the physical embodiment of what made America unique in the 19th century. The willingness to learn from anyone, to combine traditions that had never been combined before, to create something new from the synthesis of old wisdom. Every December, something remarkable happens at Devil's Crown Peak. Morrison's descendants, and that line includes senators, teachers, at least one Olympic marksman, and a surprising number of engineers, gather at the spot where their ancestor faced down a legend. They fire a single shot into the winter sky, honoring not just a man or a hunt, but a moment when mockery met mastery, when three cultures fused in one man's courage. But perhaps the most important legacy isn't the rifle or the story, or even the techniques Morrison developed. It's the principle he embodied, that in America, survival belonged not to the strongest, or the wealthiest, or the best connected, but to those who adapted, learned, and never forgot that respect was earned one impossible shot at a time. Think about that the next time someone dismisses something as a pretty toy, or underestimates the quiet competence of someone who doesn't fit their expectations. Because somewhere out there, in boardrooms and battlefields, in laboratories and legislatures, Jake Morrison's spirit lives on in everyone who understands that the most dangerous opponent is the one who combines preparation with precision, who learns from every available source, and who never, ever gives up when fighting for something that matters. That's not just frontier wisdom, folks. That's the American way. And it all started with a man, a rifle, and the moment when Eastern mockery met Western steel in a trading post at the edge of nowhere, changing everything that came after.